Hello, guys and gals, and welcome. Welcome. So today we're going to be talking about Sunder Charms. It's been almost 2 years. We're getting there. I figured we're close enough. I think the Sunder Charms came out in like August of like 2022. So it's been like 2 years basically since Sunder Charms came out. And I kind of wanted to like get a better, video out there talking about Sunder Charms. And kind of like, how are they doing? Like, were they received by the community? I mean, I remember a lot of doomsaying when they first came out, and honestly, I feel like they have been a positive influence on Diablo 2 for the most part. I would be interested to hear what you guys think about the Sunder Charms, but I'm going to tell you what I think about the Sunder Charms today, and we're going to go over that. Now, first off, what are Sunder Charms? If you guys have never actually played around with Sunder Charms are things that allow you to break a resistance. So you basically are able to break resistances with this. It brings the monster down to 95% of that resistance, whatever it is. So if you break the resistance, you only get basically a 5% reduction off of 100, which isn't like the most amazing thing in the world. But when you see how it works, like for instance, if I'm fighting a monster that's fire immune, of course that guy's cold immune, so that doesn't work. These guys are cold too. I don't want to play with you. Kick you in the face. So you can't believe there's no falling out here. There's no falling. What is this? A fallenless cold plains? This is bullcrap. That's what this is. Okay. There we go. So we got some falling here. Let me use these guys as my guinea pigs. So you see they don't have any resistances. Pick up the charm, however, and then they have fire immunity. See? It just directly takes that fire immunity away and brings them down to only a meager 5% of their total resistances. Of course, you also get a penalty in the process, which is a negative to your fire resistance for having that charm on your character, right? So, for instance, you can see this very clearly. So it's a 73% penalty, and you can see my fire resistance go down, or rather go up when I pick up the charm back to 85%, and goes down to 40 when I put the charm back on, because I'm losing a massive amount of resistances for putting that charm on. I'm also overcapped on fire res at 213%, so some of that is being negated by the overcap. And basically what it means is that when you put these on, you do get a large amount of penalty. In the case of Bone Break, you're actually losing physical damage reduction. So you see here it says physical damage received reduced by 49%. And when I put this down, I lose 11% of that, which brings me down to 38% physical damage reduced. The beauty of these charms, though, is that they allow you to bypass immunities, and with the correct equipment, like for instance things that will give you negative fire resistance, or things that give you negative cold or negative poison or negative lightning, or curses that give you negative physical resistance, and so forth and so on. You can bypass immunities through very specific setups, which has made in general like negative resistance equipment much more powerful than it ever was in previous seasons before Sunder Charms were added. Overall, though, I think that they're a good thing within the game, but we're going to talk about their pros and their cons real quick, and why particularly I think that they're good. So I got a little notepad. Look at my pretty little notepad here. Were Sunder Charms a good addition 2 years later? Well, first off, pros. They're not obtainable until beating Hell Bale, which helps to maintain the original game before Sunder Charms. So in single player, you basically don't have access to these at all until you kill Hell Bale. And I've been misquoted on this before. So many people come in angry later, and they're like, "You can get Sunder Charms on single player," and they start smashing the table. But that's not what I'm saying. So if you start a single player character, you cannot get access to Sunder Charms without cheating until you kill Hell Bale and gain access to Terror Zones. Once you kill Hell Bale and gain access to Terror Zones, then yes, you can have access to Sunder Charms. But because of the nature of single player, when you start your first single player character, you are going to have to play the original game as it was before Sunder Charms were added, because you will not have access to Sunder Charms until you kill Hell Bale. Which basically means that the original game, the game that existed before Sunder Charms were added, still exists, at the beginning of a ladder when nobody has any Sunder charms, at the beginning of a single player session when you don't have access to, terror zones in hell yet, and honestly in any situation where you don't have access to negative resistance equipment either, because you have to have negative resistance equipment to make them work. Just having the Sunder charm itself isn't enough to make your character 100% viable. They enable as many builds that were impossible before. This is kind of a really big pro for Sunder Charms that I really, 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 really enjoy. And it's something that I feel like a lot of people overlook when they talk about Sunder Charms, and they try and say that they're bad or they're negative. But the truth of the matter is Sunder Charms enabled massive numbers of builds. Dragon Tail, for instance, is an ability that probably never would have worked very well without Sunder Charms. And it has to do with the fact that it's actually 2 resistances in one attack, so it's actually physical and fire resistance. So you actually need negative physical resistance and negative fire resistance. And as soon as you come across a monster that is immune to either of those elements, fire or physical, you will run into a brick wall in terms of damage output. Wake of Fire and Wake of Inferno fire trap sins were basically enabled by Fire Sunders. There was pretty much no way that you were ever going to be able to make a viable Wake of Fire, Wake of Inferno. In fact, pretty much all fire characters across the board, because fire is one of the most common immunities within the game. Pretty much all fire characters were enabled by Fire Sunders. Poison characters got a nice little boon from those because, of course, there's plenty of poison immune monsters. And just about, I don't even know, hundreds, maybe even more than 100 builds across the board, across all 7 characters. There's definitely builds within the characters that made things, made it possible for you to create very interesting builds within the game. And this is not just the ability to make more builds, but it also is the fact that the game feels more like it did when synergies didn't exist. So for those of you who don't remember, back before Diablo 2 Lord of Destruction and synergies were added, you could basically build whatever you want. You could build, I could put 20 points in Wake of Fire, and I didn't have to put 20 points into Wake of Inferno or Fire Blast. And then I could take, go over here, and I could grab something from the martial arts tree, and I could put 20 points in Lightning Sentry, and I could have Wake of Fire and Lightning Sentry together, and I can build, whatever I wanted to and spread my points all over the place and still get pretty good effectiveness out of my skills. But when synergies were added, they tied everything down to the point where you kind of had to build completely into a tree to get access to the damage output that you needed for hell difficulty, and it basically made it very restrictive, so that, for instance, on the fire druid as an example, he's going to spend basically all his points in the fire tree just to get decent damage output. And you can't really do that with immunities. So, if I have, 110 points and I put all of my 110 points in fire skills, when I come across a fire immune, I'm going to be SOL. And there's nothing that I can do about it. And this is kind of a nasty thing when it comes to how synergies kind of change the game for the worse, and how Sunder Charms kind of changed the game back a little bit by enabling a little bit more of the ability to create characters that you'd actually, have fun playing all over the place, as opposed to just simply forcing you into one particular block of abilities. They increased the value of negative resistance equipment. So all negative resistance equipment across the board has become more valuable as a result of Sunder Charms, because Sunder Charms don't really work without negative resistance equipment. So things like Facets, Crescent Moon, Phoenix, Mangsong's Lesson, Doom Weapons, all sorts of crazy things that have negative resistance. Even Wizendraw, which is a surprisingly amazing change, because Wizendraw probably wasn't very valuable before the Sunder Charms, but after the Sunder Charms were added with a massive negative 40% cold resistance on it, became one of the best in slot pieces for freezing arrows ons, and also a halfway decent early option for even a hurricane druid using cold. You don't have to stay in your lane anymore. This is another very big pro. So as we talked about earlier, and some people, I think, mistakenly have this idea that Sunder Charms made the game easier. This is what they believe. They believe that it made the game easier, but it's a lie. This is a lie, because immunities never made the game harder. They made the game more monotonous. Because if you were a cold sorceress, for instance, you would just go to the tunnels. And because you're a cold sorceress, like if you have a Sunder Charm and some negative resistance equipment, you don't have to stay in your lane anymore, and mindlessly farm the same zone 10,000 times, which is nice. And I'm deliberately looking at you, you tunnel dwelling rat sorks. Yeah, you heard me. So while I can understand the sentiment that they made the game easier, I also can't understand it, because at any time that you would simply have a character that was, say, fire or lightning or ice or poison or physical, what you would do is you would stay in your lane. So, your cold sorceresses would be going to the tunnel because there's no cold immunes there, or there's very few. Your magic damage characters, it can farm pretty much anywhere, but on top of that, your lightning damage characters would go to specific zones. The cow level obviously has very few immunities, but it really came down to the fact that you would find a specific area in which your character was good at farming, and then you would farm that area 10,000 times until you got whatever you needed. But that's not really fun gameplay, farming the same exact zone 10,000 times. And so when they added Terror Zones and they added Sunder Charms, and it opened up the game a little bit so that characters could farm more than just their, associated area, honestly, the game got better as a result. What are the cons of Sunder Charms? Well, you need negative resistance to make them work. They don't work without negative resistance at all. If you don't have any form of negative resistance equipment, that 95% resistant monster might as well still be immune, because 95% basically is still immune. I mean, it's not immune technically, and you can hit the target and they take a little bit of damage, but it takes a very long time to dish out damage and kill a monster that's 95% immune to your respective element. You also need plus resistance to counter the effect of the Sunder Charms. So that's another big one, is that obviously the Sunder Charms themselves come with a massive penalty, and the penalty that they come with has to be countered. If you don't counter the penalty, then you're going to end up with a huge amount of negative resistance. As you can see, with the Sunder Charm out of my inventory, I'm at 45% fire, but with the Sunder Charm in my inventory, I'm at 28% fire, which is painful. And of course, I have to use Fade to be able to counter that. And even with Fade, I'm still only at 40% fire resistance with the Sunder Charm. Whereas without it, I would be capped. And this is going to be a big issue for a lot of characters, especially for things like the Bone Break Charm, because the negative resistance that they offer is kind of massive. Another con for the Sunder Charms is that some of them are exceedingly rare. The Bone Break one, for some reason, is very rare. So Bone Break, very rare. And on top of this, the other thing about the Bone Break is that, well, it's not as useful as the others. I would put a con down here that the Black Cleft, which is the which is the magic one, is not as useful as the others also. But honestly, I think this was a deliberate change, because they always knew that the magic damage characters had basically no issue with magic, monsters, because most monsters in the game don't have magic immunity, and on top of that, most monsters in the game are not resistant to magic either. So I guess they kind of put the Black Cleft into the game as like a big, giant middle finger to, Hammerdins and such that have no issues farming pretty much anywhere within the game. And it's kind of funny to me, because I don't really see that as a con. I just see that as kind of, like a laughable state that the Hammerdins always had an easy time farming everywhere in the game, and that's why people would choose the Hammerdin, right? Well, now that everybody has the ability to achieve the same thing as the Hammerdin, they were like, okay, well, let's give the Hammerdin the ability to farm everyone in the game, and then they all started laughing because the Hammerdin already had it, so they didn't really get any bonus whatsoever for the most part from having the Black Cleft. And there's no negative resistance equipment that you can find for magic anyway, so you can't bring it down below that that degree. I mean, overall, when it comes to Sunder Charms, I could even rank them, so we could do like a quick ranking here. So Sunder charm ranking. So how would I rank them? Honestly, it seems to me like cold is pretty much number one. And then followed by lightning, which is followed by fire. And then after fire, I would say bone break, most likely. And then finally the poison sunder. And then I said finally, but way down at the bottom, like, we might as well just, like, put a couple spaces here. Way down at the bottom is the black cleft, which is absolutely terrible. Like, we should just put, like a rock, like a stamina potion, um, and some bolts slash arrows, like, on the list in between the black cleft, because the black cleft is so low on the list that it might as well not even exist. It has very little usefulness whatsoever, because whenever you do encounter a magic immune monster, the 95% resistant monster is still going to pretty much just ignore any attempts you have to kill him. I mean, you can kill him eventually, but the other interesting thing is that most of the monsters that are immune to the Black Cleft, or that the Black Cleft would actually work on, usually dish out magic damage. Which means that putting it on is actually quite dangerous, because it's going to reduce your magic immunity, and reducing your magic immunity is not a good thing when you're fighting a monster that dishes out magic damage. So there's a very good chance you could die, given the right situations. One of the most classic examples of a magic immune monster that Hammerdins and other magic damage characters usually have issues with is the Wave 2 on Veil Run, and Herodrum fire a Dark Star projectile, which is 100% magic damage. If you were to fight a extra fast, multi-shot Act 2 wave, they could potentially rip you to shreds if you were holding on to a Black Cleft at the same time. I mean, I've been ripped to shreds by them without a Black Cleft, so I can only imagine that if you got the right combination of modifiers on one of these Herodrum packs, and they fired the Dark Stars at you quickly enough with a multi-shot, extra fast, pattern, you're probably going to go down like a sack of potatoes. Trading, which is something we're going to talk about. So Black Clefts or Sunder Charms in general have become really good trading, and I forgot to put that in there. Trading items, especially in early ladder, so they're very popular trading items. And the fact that they have varying degrees of usefulness, so obviously the 70% is your perfect, and the 95% is like, or 90% is the anti-perfect. But they're very popular trading items early on in ladder. It's very nice to get your hands on them, trade them for low to mid runes, or sometimes even high runes, depending on which ones you've got. And usually it ends up being the cold being the most valuable early on in ladder. Eventually, the lightning becomes more valuable than the cold as the cold ones become saturated in the community. Fires basically are not even like worth anything unless they're basically like 70% perfects. They basically need to be 70% perfect, so they're just not even valuable. Bone breaks tend to be rarer, and they tend to be valuable just simply because they're rare, but they do have a really high physical damage penalty, so you want to have one that's closer to the 10% range. Poison Sunders are basically completely useless unless you have a 70%, and even when you have a 70%, you still might not be able to trade it off, because the unfortunate thing about Poison Sunders is there's not a lot of characters that actually use poison damage. There's very few poison damage builds, and there's very few poison damage builds that actually work properly. I can count them like literally on one hand. And then even if you included, say, some other odd poison damage builds like stacking poison charms and whatnot, the number is just not really all that high. So they tend to be not really worth very much, even if they're 70%ers. Black Cleft, like, I don't really think this one actually has any value, but I have heard of sometimes some Hammerdins trading for them specifically to get past to the Act 2 wave on Pale runs. But I don't know, whatever they're willing to pay for it, I guess. So if you have one and you want to try and trade it off, and some poor unfortunate Hammerdin actually wants to hold on to this thing, then do it. Like, just get rid of it. Personally, though, I usually just drop them back on the ground, but maybe they're worth posting up just to see if you can get some kind of rune out of. Maybe even a co or a pole rune early on in ladder might be worthwhile. I don't know. Probably better off with rocks and stamina potions and bolts. Overall, though, like, I've had a lot of fun creating builds around Sunder Charms that were never really possible before. And some of them have been absolutely amazing to play around with. Like, for instance, my Stormhowl Barbarian or my Thor Barbarian. These are characters that are set up specifically with the idea of utilizing, like massive amounts of lightning damage, massive amounts of, negative resistances, and so forth and so on, so that they can have the ability to kill monsters, right? But without a lightning sunder to break the immunity, all the negative resistances in the world wouldn't really be all that helpful to, the characters. And I seem to have stolen his gloves, his belt, and his boots for some reason. Why is he missing everything? Poor guy. I bet he still whoops some booty cheeks even without his gloves, belt, or boots. Let's go punch some stuff. No gloves, no belt, and no boots. And he's still ripping things to shreds. And this is just one such character that wouldn't really be possible without the Sunder Charms. There's hundreds of builds that wouldn't be possible without the Sunder Charms. And I feel like what we've gained from the Sunder Charms far outweighs anything that we lost. With this particular character, like with Barbarians, I mean, Barbarians are probably the least affected by Sunder Charms, but then I started to think about alternative builds that you could use using elemental damage. And that's when I came up with a character that was basically designed around the idea of the Crescent Moon and allows you to get the high negative res. So I have about, 70% negative enemy lightning resistance. And it allows me to basically completely bypass the immunity of pretty much any monster and the resistances of any monster by using a non-physical damage setup. And it's actually kind of neat. I wish I had my boots on here so my character would actually, be dishing out some decent damage. Boots, gloves, I'm missing IAS. I'm missing all sorts of doojanks on this guy. He's still ripping stuff to shreds, though. But of course, I always get confused because I see the werewolf and I always think it's the druid. And even though I know I'm not on the druid, I still start to think it's the druid. I'm trying to think if there's anything else to talk about with this. I kind of wanted to pull up the druid because the druid is definitely one of those characters that gained a lot from this. First off, the elemental, the entire fire side of the tree basically became like fully useful when Sunder Charms were announced. The ability to break fire immunities is massive for this particular character. For the shape-shifting tree, Rabies actually got quite a bump from having access to a Poison Sunder so that you can actually break the poison immunities. And once you can break your poison immunities, you can actually kill all those monsters with Rabies. Rabies is still kind of subpar, unfortunately, but that's just because of the way the ability works. But, it works. Fire Claws also became highly viable once the Fire Sunder came into play and you could break fire immunities, and so forth and so on. There's just so many different things on all the characters that, work now. They actually work. For instance, with the Paladin. Now, let's go take a look at the Paladin real quick. So the Paladin, it was always kind of difficult to break immunities if you were trying to do a specific aura, like if you wanted to self-wield Holy Fire, Holy Freeze, or Holy Shock. Having the Sunders in made all of these viable, so if you want to do self-wielded Holy Fire, self-wielded Holy Freeze, or self-wielded Holy Shock, you can make all those work now without the need for Conviction. You just need enough negative res to bypass the immunities. On top of this, there's also just a lot of fun with skills like Vengeance that don't need the Sunders. But if you added the Sunder in, you could potentially get some decent damage output that way as well. I don't know why I dropped that diamond. Get back in my inventory, sir. Is that a Wiz and Draw? That is a Wiz and Draw. The beautiful build, beautiful Wiz and Draw that only became valuable after Sunder Charms were added to the game. Going over some other characters. I mean, the sorceress is probably one of the characters that got affected by this the most. And it's really due to the fact that it was very hard to build a sorceress prior to the Sunder Charms because the problem was is you always had to kind of dual spec. You know, like you were doing things like Frozen Orb, you know, Firewall, or you were doing like Frozen Orb Fireball, or maybe you did like, you know, like lightning frozen orb or whatever it is, but you always had to have like two elements in case you came across an immune monster, or you just had to just skip everything that was immune to your particular elements. But now tons and tons of builds have become viable. Obviously they fixed the cold mastery things. The cold mastery is penalized now. And overall, I mean, it just feels like pretty much every single build on the sorceress is viable at this point. Chain lightning got fixed with an X hit delay stuff too. So chain lightning, lightnings, charged bolt, Nova. I mean, you can even use T-Storm now if you want to. You can make a glacial spike, ice blast build. Blizzard's really powerful these days. Frozen orb. I mean, fireball's really powerful. Enchant sorks are more powerful than ever due to the ability to break fire immunities. Of course, meteor sorceresses are pretty good. Firewall sorks, the whole 9 yards. I mean, pretty much every single build became viable once Thunder Charms came into play, and build diversity just blossomed as a result. And I think that's like one of the biggest pros that you can possibly talk about is just the build diversity. And I know that I didn't write it here, but enabling many builds that were possible before. I mean, just amazing build diversity. And this is not a bad thing. Like enabling all these builds that were basically impossible for before it's never going to be a bad thing. I don't care what anyone says about Sunder Charms or how bad that you guys think they are, but the ability to play some of these builds that were never possible before. Freezing Arrow was always an amazingly fun build, but before Sunder Charms, it was not really all that useful because there were far too many cold immunes within the game to really make it viable. And the same thing went for Exploding Arrow and Immolation Arrow, is that the massive number of fire immunes basically made the build just untenable. Like you couldn't really get the best out of it. And the same thing goes for the lightning side of the tree. Like Lightning Strike, Charge Strike, and even Lightning Fury itself were relatively ineffective versus lightning immune monsters, and being able to break immunities was very difficult. Even with a Infinity, even with, you know, like negative res equipment before Sunders, it was still very difficult to kill monsters with, you know, just your basic lightning attacks. And Sunders, you know, fixed that and opened up the lightning characters to basically the entire game. Even the Plague Javazon, which is extremely powerful now. I did a Plague Javazon this season. Would not really have been possible without the Poison Sunder. I mean, and that's just, we haven't even gone over all the characters yet. Who am I missing? The Necromancer. So the Necromancer has had some really interesting builds pop up because of the addition of Sunders. And you might think, well, the Necromancer doesn't really have a lot that Sunder Charms are going to help him with, right? Well, I mean, they do have, obviously, the Poison and Bone Tree has Poison, and Poison Nova did gain greatly from the addition of the Poison Sunder. They gain nothing from the actual bone side of the Poison and Bone Tree, though. But on top of that, we also get access to a lot of interesting ways that you can build characters. And one of the interesting ways that I ended up building my character was an entirely fire-based Necromancer. I utilize very high-level enchant on my mercenary, which gives me about 401 enchant damage for my minions. And I spend that to get a huge amount of fire damage on all of my minions utilizing lower resistance. And this is just one of the many fun builds that I've been able to create using this stuff. So let's go ahead and suck up an army real quick. And of course, once you have your army made, it's actually pretty easy to get the damage out. Now, the beauty of this build is that when I'm using enchant, my army is gaining the full attack rating. All the fire damage. Every single minion is getting fire damage. Every single minion is gaining my negative resistance, too. So I have a pretty strong amount of negative resistance on this character of negative 34%. But what I also have is a pretty good plus to skills, and then this is the reason why I'm using Mang Song's Lesson, is because Mang Song's Lesson gives me the ability to have plus 5 to skills alongside of a very nice negative 19% enemy fire res. It'd be 20 if I had a perfect Mang Songs, but I don't. And this allows me to utilize my little minions to dish out massive amounts of fire damage to the enemy. As you can see, they pretty much have no trouble with dealing with most of these monsters. And of course, I could utilize my revives as well in this. And once you get everything set up, once you get all your revives going, once you get all of your minions going, and your mercenary enchants every single minion, you get a really nice amount of fire damage. In fact, we can calculate out my fire damage real quick. Let me get my minions all summoned. I believe 21 is my limit. So as you can see, I currently have 21 revives. I currently have 15 skeletons, so we take 21 plus 15, and we also get the golem too, so we add the golem in, so one more, which means we have 37 minions currently. He'll enchant every single one of them, and we are looking at a max damage of 401 fire damage, right? So we take that 401, we multiply it, 401. And the monsters are dishing out 14,837 damage per attack rotation, which is pretty darn nice. And of course, I can get archers, I can get all sorts of things. Honestly, this build would not have been possible without Sunders. It's a very fun build. It's a very neat build and a very interesting use of game mechanics. But for the most part, if I wasn't utilizing a Sunder Charm with this build, it just wouldn't be possible. And I think that's the most redeeming characteristic that Sunder Charms added into Diablo, is that they added the ability to create amazing, fun, and fanciful builds that were really not possible before. Opening up build diversity and making these things possible, making these crazy builds possible, is why I think Sunder Charms are, without a doubt, one of the best additions to Diablo 2 in a long time, right alongside of Terror Zones. And after 2 years of messing around with them, of them being in the game, playing with them, seeing how they have affected the game economy, seeing how they have affected, the use of specific items like facets, the comeback of the Arcane's Valor because it's the only +2 piece of equipment that you could utilize a facet in, and having so many different choices across the board in terms of what you can do with your characters now, it definitely has opened up the game as a whole, in my opinion, to, for the better. I've had so much fun creating these crazy builds, and the number of crazy builds I've made is rather silly. From everything to a fire necromancer, to something like a poison Amazon that literally just uses poison damage to kill everything around her in a matter of seconds. This is just one such example. I might as well show you a couple here. But, like, for instance, when you use this particular character is using a Poison Sunder, of course. And the Poison Sunder and massive amounts of poison damage, and allows her to dish out a massive amount of poison damage to targets. So high, in fact, that the monsters literally melt before your very eyes. So when you're dishing out damage to the monsters with this poison damage and the Poison Sunder, you can see that the monsters just, and they're dead.
It's locked.
Another of many builds that wouldn't have been possible without Sunders. I'm never going to say that Sunders are a bad thing. I would like to hear what you guys have to say on it, but don't expect me to be receptive to Sunders are the worst thing in the world, because I can't really see it. The sheer number of characters that I've been able to create because of Sunder Charms, the fun builds, the elemental builds, the holy zealers, the fire, like exploding arrow demon machine sorceresses, the fire necromancers, the freezing arrow Amazons, and so forth and so on. There's just so many fun builds that you can create now with the addition of Sunder Charms, and it just makes the game so much more fun as a result, because there's so many more options for you to play around with. Anyway, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos, even when I'm just ranting about Sunder Charms. And as always, keep watching.